Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ryan Ride Mechanic channel. How the heck are you doing today? Today's video, in light of recent events, we're going to talk about what happens to rides in severe storm weather. Something like a hurricane. So we've just recently had, a little while back, we had a set of hurricanes come through Florida. And a lot of people contacted me and say, hey, what happens to these rides? What's going to happen to them? What do we know? And I want to talk about that today. So let's get into it.
Now get ready. Here we go.
Okay, if this is your first time here, make sure you like and subscribe for more content like this. Do all the stuff downstairs. It does help me out, but you guys know what to do. So let's get right into this. Okay. Hurricanes, natural disasters, tornadoes, things like that, they're extremely hard to deal with because each one is extremely unique. They're not like a standard thing that happens. We can make procedures and steps for standard things that happens, but we can't when it comes to these big, massive events like that. And I'm going to throw earthquakes into there too. Coming from California, we had to deal with earthquakes. So I'm going to talk about kind of like, not quite disasters, but kind of like natural disasters, storms and things like that. So all honesty, I've never been through a hurricane. It's not been one of my things, but judging by what I've seen in other places and knowing some things from like parks that have gone through them and talking with people and getting their experience from it, I'm going to go over some generalized stuff and some generalized rule of thumbs and things like that we're going to look at. A couple of weeks ago, we had a set of hurricanes go through Florida area, took out a bunch of stuff, wiped out a lot of things, did a lot of damage. So, and it was like, what are we going to do with the parks in those areas? What do they have to do to get back up and running? Well, it was all dependent on how badly their park was hit. That's pretty much it. The rides are made to withstand high winds. They're made to withstand lots of water. So we don't have a problem there. But when you flood, you have a problem. If you get winds over like 90, 100 miles an hour, of course, there's going to be some problems there too. But most of the time, I think if you talk with engineers that deal with ride structures and stuff, they're rated up to like really high wind numbers because the structures are very big. They're meant to handle that sort of stuff. Wooden structures, not so much because the wood has so much surface area that it's more susceptible to wind. So wind does kind of affect wood structures, but the good news is wood structures are not that high up in the air most of the time, and the air down at the ground level typically moves a little bit slower. It's more diffuse than it is higher up. Don't get much of that straight line wind higher up. So most of the damage that's done is typically done with flooding. That's the main thing that you have to worry about. The water that surrounds the ride damages it in two ways. One, the control system. If the park was able to, before it came in, they might have done something like if it was in a low-lying area, they might have tried to remove some control paneling, removed wires, maybe taken the PLC out of the thing. But if the control room for a ride was underwater, then you have to assume that all those controls inside of that cabinet might be damaged to the point where you have to throw them away. How do you recover from that? You pretty much dry them out. What are some things that get hit really hard? It's the infrastructure stuff. It's all the buildings in the parks. The buildings get hit really hard because you have employees working in them. Now, you can't have a building that was filled with water and then just have people go right back to work in it because that could create mold, and then you might create long-term sickness with mold. So you have to be very careful about how you bring your employees back to work after that to make sure the buildings didn't withstand a lot of damage and continually have mold growing on the inside. That's not a good thing for the employees. Water produces some more hazards to it. There's a couple of different things, but realistically, you have to worry about the current. Now, typically, if you have flooding, that means water is moving. And while water moves, that's a lot of hydraulic force. It can move a lot of stuff around. It can take buildings with it. It can move things out of place. Now, as I said, structures are rated for wind, and they can handle wind and things like that. But if you take a building and run it into the side of the structure, that's a problem. Like, you're going to have an unknown problem there, because it was like, you can't just call the manufacturer up and say, hey, a building hit my ride, what do I do? But they will want to know, like, was there damage? Was the support pillars, like, kinked or caved in on one side? Like, something really heavy ran into it. You might have to do things like take geological reference measurements. This is kind of where I was going with water as well, too, because, well, steel does float. The support tubes that hold up the ride, you got to remember they're hollow and they're welded on both sides. They're not like a tube that's hollow on the inside. They're capped on both ends, so it has air on the inside of that. So if you take that tube and drop it like into the ocean, that support pillar will actually float, just like a boat. It'll float there. Well, if your water is deep enough and you have enough of those tubes at a low level, they also want to float. They create their own buoyancy. So does the track, because it's got the big backbone, or sometimes multiple backbones, and they can create their own buoyancy as well. Not everything will. It all depends on how deep the water and how much surface area you have, or how much square footage you have underneath the water. But one thing that can do is that over time, those footers that are sunk way into the ground, well, they're only good in that ground as long as the ground around it is okay. So what's the first thing you got to do before you can get any erection on a ride, right? Anytime you set a ride up, anytime you erect a ride, you have to go out there and survey the ground. The ground has to be the right density, and it has to be compact and everything else in there. They might say, okay, these footers, these column footers, they might have to go down 35 feet. Okay, so you drill a hole down 35 feet, and you have to check the soil as you're doing it. If you hit loose soil down there that's 20 feet down, they might go, ooh, what? You know what? Now you have to go to 55 feet. And this is all done by engineers. It's not like, yeah, we just have this feeling. The engineers will tell you how far down it has to go based on the soil compaction in the area. So that is a big thing, so that the soil doesn't change. But one of the things to look for is if there's a standing water table around there where there's a lot of water, that changes how dense that soil is. So if that whole area floods, and it's flooded for a long time. Now, this is not something like we typically see with hurricanes, where the water comes in, does all sorts of damage, and then it comes right back out again. This is something more like a New Orleans thing, where the area flooded and it stayed flooded, and we couldn't get it to unflood. At that point, the water was saturating the ground in such a way to where now they couldn't guarantee that those pillars set down inside the ground were going to be the same once it dried out. The soil compaction is starting to change. Not to mention all of your buildings, all of your infrastructure, all of your wiring, everything like that for the sitting water scenario is toast at that point in time. Everything's destroyed. So that's one of the reasons why that Six Flags New Orleans was abandoned, just because everything was so destroyed. It was not economically feasible to get it back to running. And unfortunately, when you deal with that much water and you deal with things possibly floating around, impacting pillars and stuff like that, engineers don't really want to get back behind that either and say, oh yeah, that structure will be fine afterwards, because they honestly don't know what happened to it. And especially for something like New Orleans, where it was submerged for so long, no one really knows the outcome of that. So I feel like, I don't know for sure, but I feel like that's one of the main contributing factors to why New Orleans was just written off and they got rid of it. And a lot of people have asked me in the past, like, hey, how come they didn't relocate those rides? Well, you would have just been able to relocate the track and structure. And honestly, I don't think the engineers wanted to stand behind the track and structure, because of it possibly having other damage that they just couldn't really anticipate. There's no real things to say like, yes, this is what happens if your ride is underwater for this long. Hasn't been done. So I think for have a safety aspect and then just the accounting side of it, like if you move a ride, then that's money moving and they have to account for it. If you say we're just going to trash the whole park, then the accountants can write off the whole park, but it has to stay there. You can't take a ride out and still write it off. It's not a free ride. So it's got to be accounted for somewhere. So I think in a situation like a hurricane, it feels like things moving in the water is going to do the most damage. You know, we've seen it on TV. You've seen a house float along and a house runs into other houses, buildings move down the street. It's like when you have mud and silt and houses moving around, when they impact the structure, don't know what that's going to do. You know, if you have a good swift current and you have a house floating down it and it hits a wooden roller coaster, there's, probably a chunk of that wooden roller coaster is trash at that point. Can they fix it? It's like they might be able to, but you are now up against an unknown amount of damage, and that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. So this is one of the reasons why natural disasters and all this stuff is really hard to say, well, yes, this for sure is going to happen, because in some areas of these hurricanes, it was simply just a lot of rain fell and some branches broke off of trees, and that was the end of it. And it was no big deal. Like, the park could easily reopen the next day, but all the infrastructure around the park was taken out. You might have a problem with power, not being able to get power to it. You might have a problem with roadways going into and out of. All your employees might still be evacuated. Like, these are reasons why the parks stay closed for a longer period of time than just a hurricane passing. Again, it's all on a case-by-case basis, and I think the important thing is that people are safe, not that the park is back up and running. So once the people come back and everyone's happy, then they can get the park back up and running. The second part of the video is more, let's talk about earthquakes. So I come from California, which is earthquake country. While I was out there, we experienced a couple of earthquakes. Most of them weren't too bad. There was one that was pretty good right towards the end of my employment there, and that did a lot of damage in the surrounding area. We had to figure out how to come back from that. Now, the instructions were, okay, it had an earthquake. It was all the rides were down. Of course, the park was closed anyway, so that helped. It happened while we were closed. That was a plus. If we were to experience an earthquake with the park open, all the rides would be shut down, safely unloaded. If a train was going up a lift hill, we'd hit ride stop and probably not let it progress any further. And from a safety point of view, we'd probably evacuate that train on the lift hill. But if there was already a train in the station and like one in the brakes ready to go, we would just evacuate the one in the station and just, hey, get off, and then move the next train back in, you guys get off, and then continue on doing stuff we needed to. So we had lots of damage in the surrounding area, and then we had to go through and figure out what happened to the rides. So we did two things. We did a weekly, a daily, and a monthly inspection. So we did 3 different levels of inspection to each ride before it opened up. We also had our NDT company come in and spot check a bunch of places around on the rides. I think they went and looked at every single ride, but not like with a fine-tooth comb looked at it. They kind of just looked at it in general and said, yeah, we don't see anything that's concerning out here. And some of the bigger rides they looked at more closely, but smaller stuff like kids ride, there's like, yeah, it's okay. These are traveling rides. They're meant to get jostled around. They're fine. One that we had trouble with was actually, of all things, it was our wooden roller coaster. I would have thought that would have held up the best. And I don't know if it was just ours or if it was normal for wooden roller coasters to have trouble during an earthquake. But I remember our Woody was down for a couple of days. It broke a lot of stuff out there. We had all sorts of problems all over the place with it. But that earthquake was fairly large, so it wasn't too surprising with that. But once we were done with the general inspections on it, and we had a couple people signing off each inspection, so it wasn't just one mechanic looking at it, we contacted the manufacturers and asked them if there was anything we needed to do special before we opened back up. And they said, well, you need to inspect this stuff. I'm like, yeah, we already did that. And so they're like, okay. And they couldn't think of anything else. Again, this is just like bad storms. It's all on a case-by-case basis with not a lot of like factual information driving it, because it's a crapshoot every time you do something like this. It's like, who knows what is actually going to happen, because it depends. The earthquakes could be real bad if they go one way. If they go up and down really hard, it might not do any damage. But if it goes left to right really hard, it might do a ton of damage. Or if it rolls, or if it does something else, it's all very interesting. I've, growing up, the majority of all the earthquakes I've ever lived through never really did any damage. But the last one that I was actually working at the park with, that did some damage around the surrounding area. A lot of the homes were damaged around there, so not to take lightly. And then you also have to worry about things like, okay, the earth moved, so how's my infrastructure? Again, we go back to infrastructure. How's my electrical? Do areas of the park still have power? Did we lose high voltage coming into the park? Did we lose high voltage at one of the substations around the park? Did we lose a water main? Did we lose a gas main? There's all sorts of things that you just have to kind of just start walking around and noticing and just like, what's happening? And you really have to keep your eyes open, looking for things that might be minor, but is kind of major. I've been at the park when a underground water main broke, and it wasn't this catastrophic geyser in the air like you would picture. It was simply just, we walking by this like picnic grove area where the water main had broken, and we were just like, there's a lot of water coming from the grass. And we were just like, they just must have just watered the grass. Okay. So then we come back, and then it's like, no, there's still a lot of water coming from the grass. There's like a stream of water. Like someone left the hose on, and the hose is just running out over the pathway. We're like, is there a broken sprinkler head? We were looking out over the grass and we couldn't see anything. It wasn't like water shooting up or anything like that. So we called the trades guys down. Trades guys they deal with like water and electrical and stuff like that. The infrastructure support for the buildings and the rest of the park. They went out to look at it, and they called us back and said, hey, come check this out. Okay. That's always cool to hear calls like that, because it's like, whom would you find? So we go over there and walk out, and it's like, hey, what's going on? And he's like, we've got a problem. I'm just a ride supervisor. Like, I don't like, okay, what's the problem? Tell me about it. So he's like, I'll show you. And he's like, just pay attention to where I'm walking. Okay, that's a weird statement to make. So he goes out to this grass that's got water coming out from underneath it, and he starts walking out to the grass, and I'm like, I don't see what the big deal is. And then he kind of goes out like 20 feet, and he says, do you notice anything? And I'm like, honestly, no. Like, what's the deal? And then he starts like jumping up and down, and then I noticed that the grass looks like a trampoline while he's doing it. So the water main had broken under the ground and come up underneath the grass, but because the grass root structure was so tough there, the whole grass area had lifted like a trampoline head, and it looked fine, but it was slightly bowed up everywhere. So where he was actually standing on like almost like 8 to 10 inches of water. And as he jumped up and down, the grass would just sit there and flow up and down like that. It's like, oh my gosh, that's going to be a problem. So he had to find the broken water main and shut it off, and then figure out where it was broken, which is a whole different story. So these disasters really put your crew to the test, because it relies on everyone's knowledge very intricately on every single thing to pull you through it. I mean, all the sites, all the senses, everything have to be put to the test. And then the knowledge of the rides too, like to know through and to go through and do an inspection on the ride, knowing that there was just a major earthquake. And now you're sitting there saying, okay, has anything changed from the last time I see this? Have any of the welds cracked anywhere? You know, that's one of the reasons why we had 2 people going around doing the inspection. Normally, where I was, we did our inspections one person, one ride, one person. But we had pairs of people operating. That way we could double check our own work as we did it. But the manufacturers weren't a wealth of help. Neither was engineering, because no one really knew what the extent of anything was. Nobody knew what happened. So it was pretty much do your inspections, do the best you can. If you have any questions, don't operate the ride. Like if we felt something was wrong with a ride, don't operate it. If we were to put a ride into motion and it didn't run the same way, or it made a weird sound after that, be like, okay, don't run that thing. Whatever, something's going on, and we have to dig into it and figure out what it was. But even with what was that? I think it was like a 6.4 magnitude earthquake. It was pretty big. But even with a big earthquake like that, like our wooden roller coaster broke a bunch of stuff in the track and the support structure, like the vents and things like that. But outside of that, I don't think anything else really broke. The structure swayed, but we had no broken bolts. We had no cracks on welds. You know, even we very meticulously inspected those things for, days and weeks afterwards, making sure, and we had the NDT company back a bunch of times doing spot inspections on stuff and checking, and we never found anything. So the credit to the manufacturers is that they did go through a big earthquake, and we pretty much found nothing wrong with it. Honestly, the stuff we found wrong with the wooden roller coaster, we can't say for sure that it happened during the earthquake. Like, that might have happened before. And just when you have a whole bunch of people go out and look at it for the first time, maybe we were finding, like, just a lack of maintenance. Like, our carpentry crew was sloughing off or something like that. But we couldn't say for sure. Don't think that was happening, but you never know. You never know with people. So it's really the wooden roller coasters for like the hurricanes and stuff like that. That's what I worry about, is the wooden roller coasters. Because steel is pretty stout stuff. It does float. I honestly don't think you can get the water deep enough to uproot a footer. But it is possible, because when water gets underneath a footer, it can start pumping. The footer will start pumping. And by that, basically, you have a hole in the ground, and the footer is a big cylindrical object that sits down there. Well, if you get water underneath the footer, and then when the train comes around, it will eventually loosen the ground all the way around the footer. And then the footer, as the train passes by, the footer will actually lift up out of the ground. This movement would be very exaggerated. But the footer will actually lift up out of the ground and then go back down into the ground. You won't see that. It's not something you can visually see at all, so don't look for it. But if the footer does start pumping, what you will notice is that if it's wet, if it's been raining and you run the train around, if you stand right next to the footer as the train goes by and like stresses that footer to where it wants to pull on it or push on it one particular way, right where the footer goes down into the ground, you might see water actually squirt up. the water would actually just come straight up from the side of the footer, not a big geyser, not a big wave or anything else. It might be minute, but if there's no water, if the water is just sitting there at ground level and then the train comes by and a little bit of water squishes up, that means your footer's moving. And there's no fix for that. The only fix for it is to drill another pier and install another footer next to it, because apparently that ground has been compromised now, and you can't like just do a quick fix for that thing. That's major engineering to fix. It might even be to remove the section of track and remove that section of support, and then remove that pier, which would be extremely expensive, which is why I don't think this would happen. But it would be to overbore the size of that hole. You know, if it's 30 inches in diameter, you know, bore it out to 45 inches in diameter, and then make a new cage and put it back down in there, set new supports into it, and set it back down. That's why I don't think anything like that would happen. I think you would just end up putting a new one next to it at the most, if it was causing trouble. Some manufacturers might even be like, no, it's not even causing trouble. Don't worry about it. They're the ride manufacturer, not me. That's their call. But I worry about stuff in water flows hitting wooden roller coasters. Kind of an odd topic for today's video, I know. So I just wanted to talk about it, put it out there and see what happens. Let me know. I'm sure there's a lot of people on this channel that have experience with recovering rides from hurricanes and things like that. I've got the experience for earthquakes. Not too much to go on there, but you can always leave the comments down there. You can send me an email if you want, RyanTheRideMechanic@yahoo.com. Make sure you like and subscribe. Do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. Leave an idea for future topics. Let me know what you want to see and want to talk about, and we can do that. I plan on doing a live event soon. I'm not sure when though. Like, I did that one live event. I tested trying to do a live event a while back, and I'm like, what was that, a couple months ago? I look back on my channel. It was a year. It was a year ago I did that. I'm like, I should do another live event soon. That way some people can get on and ask some real-time questions and things like that. I think for that, though, I would do something on like a Saturday or a Sunday, kind of midday. That way I can catch everyone. I can catch everyone in the U.S. kind of midday, and then I can catch people over in Europe in the evening time over there as well. But I'll give a heads up before I do that. All right, I'm Ryan the Ride Mechanic. Stay off the air gates. Bye.